Well, good afternoon. This is Judy Waxman in Washington, D.C., and it is the 18th of July, 2022. Adele, could you please introduce yourself and tell us your full name, when and where you were born?
Adele Brookman, and I was born July 3rd, 1946, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Well, I have to say I knew that because Adele and I were best friends in what we called junior high then and senior high. So we'll just take it from there. So briefly, tell us like what your life was like before you got involved in the women's movement and maybe what kinds of things led you in that direction.
My own immediate family, my parents were not educated. My father was a sort of Archie Bunker character, and yet I do have some memories that pop up, like discussing politics with him, discussing Adlai Stevenson. My father was anti-intellectual, but he actually explained to me that Adlai Stevenson was an intellectual, and at least in that case, that was a good thing, even though my father was a Republican. Sort of. In later years, he came and said we were right and he was wrong. But anyway, my mother, I just saw her read the paper every day. And years later, a cousin of mine who his family had moved to Florida, to Miami. He was my favorite cousin. He became a major political activist around Miami named Radical Jack Lieberman, who we unfortunately lost in the pandemic early on. Terrible loss. He informed me that our beloved grandfather, who was a roofer, was an activist, a union activist, and one time was even hit over the head for something, spotty stories, but I didn't find that out until later. And my mother's lofty goal for me was like this: you're very pretty. You'll grow up and be a secretary and you'll marry your boss. So there was no encouragement at all for anything about education or higher education. And I often wonder, would that be the case had I been born male? I don't know. It may have still been the case. I just don't know. But great influence on me was the outer world around us. Being from the Quaker city, which at that time did have a very major Quaker influence. Public school, well-funded public school was a big influence on me. Otherwise, I never would have been to a museum or this place they used to take us called Fellowship House, which was promoting the idea of brotherhood. They didn't say sisterhood at the time, but I even wrote a little poem when I was a little girl that somebody told me was put on a plaque at Fellowship House, all about equality concerning the color of your skin or whatever religion you are. And so that was a big influence. And, sometimes you're influenced greatly by seeing what you shouldn't do and how you ought not live by your immediate family. And having TV and seeing the happy families like Ozzie and Harriet and all those kinds of things. But the Quaker influence was huge. And I remember our first day of school at Germantown High School, which I remember the population differently from you. I think you said It was broken down into thirds. I mainly remember being mostly Black, then mostly Jewish, and some smaller percentage of
Right.
others scattered in between. And anyway, I went up to the school and saw all these Black guys. At that time, they would, I think we used the word Negro. We were just beginning to use the word Black. And they were horsing around outside of the school as I was across the street, about to cross the street. And I remember feeling this feeling inside, like, and asking myself, what is this feeling? And I realized, oh my God, I'm afraid. This feeling is fear. Ew, I said to myself, literally, ew, no, you won't be prejudiced. You will not be. I didn't know the word racist, but we knew the word prejudice.
Mhm.
And I just walked, took some deep breaths, walked across the street, said hi. They said hi. The bell rang, and we all went into school. And that was a life changing event, as so many other events in our high school were going there at the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Right.
One other little anecdote I'll tell involves you always running for office, one office or another, as you were, and as your bestie, I was your campaign manager.
Definitely.
And I went around the school advertising Judy and checking in, will you vote for Judy? And there were there was a little circle of girls uh, on a landing, and they were African American. And I went up to them and said, "Will Judy have your vote?" You know, I kind of knew them, and they very warmly said to me, "No, we're not voting for white people anymore." And I, once
Wow.
again, yeah, I had an aha, like, huh, oh, yeah, I get it. I totally get it. Yeah, totally friendly interchange and more consciousness raising. And then, of course, there was Mr. Wagner, who ran the Historical Honor Society. I was vice president of that.
I was president with you.
Oh, you were president of it? Oh, great. That I didn't remember. But anyway, I have to go back into the yearbook, which you so kindly recopied for me one year when I couldn't find mine. But anyway, do you remember how we went on trips with him, like to the civil court? Well, I guess would it have been criminal court? You're the lawyer, you'll tell me.
Criminal.
Where there was a woman um, who had accused a white man, a Black woman who accused a white man of rape. And it was just a typical story of the day that they were trying to twist it that she was a prostitute. And the judge could not believe that he brought these kids to sit there in the courtroom and witness this, but
Totally remember this.
he was a wonderful teacher.
Right.
So, you know, I had influences like that as you did, being in the school at that time. And I could go on about it, but I won't.
Right.
But it's just wonderful that kids can go to school. Hopefully that will continue, public education will continue.
So what got you interested in the women's movement? Oh, by the way, I do want to say the years you're talking about for our audience is probably 62 to 64, something like that. That's when we were in high school.
Yeah, maybe the end part of 61 too. We should look that up.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, influences. Well, also during high school, my mother got sick. Well, actually, the last time I saw her sort of normal was at our junior high school graduation.
Right.
And she had a brain tumor. And, you know, going through high school with your mother sick. And I remember at times when it got to be the worst of it, I remember you coming over after school and even helping me about that. having a family doctor who lived 2 doors away. We were in row houses, of course, and she was on the corner house and barely even coming over to help me in an emergency until I called 3 times. And when it came time to go to college, and by the way, I knew nothing about going to college. There was my mother so sick, nobody was going to college in my family. And somehow I figured out how to go to college, um, probably with the help of the school counselor. And I'll tell you about how college influenced my getting into political activism, in particular women's issues. I was asked to put off starting college, which they weren't particularly supportive of my going at all anyway, um, for a few months because my mother had her health had gotten worse and worse. And, this is another question. Would I have been asked to put off going to college, stay home, and essentially be the nurse to my mother while my father was working? My older sister lived 2.5 hours away in DC, and my younger sister was in school. And would I have been asked that if I had been a man? During that time period of taking care of my mom, there was no one to turn to. Nowadays, we have a whole cancer community, largely built up by women, I am sure. And there was nothing. I just tried to find out about social service agencies, anything that might have existed to help such a young woman with caregiving and all that. And there was nothing. So that, of course, is another big influence. I finally, said goodbye to my mother. She had to be put in a nursing home. And I said my goodbye to her, which I was never sure whether she could hear me or not. And then I went to the most expedient college to get into, is what I did, because it was so late when I finally realized, oh, everybody's going to college. I should figure out how to do that too. And so I went to this place, Shippensburg State College. It had been a state teachers college. From what I understand now, it's a university, but at that time it was almost free and away, which was good. One of the classes that I had, and by the way, my mom died 8 days after I got to college. One of the classes I was in was a speech class. And this was this college was very Christian, rurally populated. The speech professor was a minister of some sort. And this college had no rules for boys, no rules. But for girls, you had to wear a skirt into the dining hall. You had to be in by 9 o'clock on the weeknights and by 11 on the weekends. I know somebody else whose interview I watched mentioned a college like this. Right. And I just, coming from the big city and, having to be so independent from what I just described, I was shocked. And I had friends at Dickinson College and I wanted to go and visit them on the weekends and blah, blah, blah. And so in this speech class, I made a speech about the double standard. It was the beginning of 65 because I had to put it off. I didn't know the word feminism. I was thinking before, when did I learn the word feminism? I do not remember. Right. I don't think I knew the word sexism, but I knew inequality and I knew double standard and fairness, unfairness. And so I made a speech about it. And it became scandalous because one of the boys in the class said, "Well, Miss Brookman, of course it's like this because boys can't get pregnant." And I said, "Well, nowadays there's such a thing as birth control, and that doesn't have to happen either." Meanwhile, I was a totally innocent little virgin myself. So that got all over the school. And I'll just fast forward to I was a controversial person and lots of things happened. I was asked to leave the school. My other professors loved me. I was doing extremely well. But anyway, when the dean of students called me in, his memorable words were something like this: "Crusaders are wonderful, Adele. The world never would have changed without them, but we don't want them here at Shippensburg." And he also ended with, they were allowing me to finish out the term because my professors came and said, "No, you can't do this." Even the minister said, "Look, some of her behavior is because her mother just died." He said, "Finish up the term and transfer to a big city university to be with your own kind." Anyway, from Shippensburg, though, in the writing class, I wrote some essay on loyalty, and the teacher sent it to the Atlantic Monthly, and I got some kind of little honorable mention or something. And they called my name up at an award ceremony, but I was no longer there at the school. My friends told me this. Then I transferred to Temple University. In the past year, I was asked to write for my affinity group. I had a very active affinity group in the 80s, and affinity groups came up around the nuclear freeze and non-intervention in Central America. Anyway, we had scattered hither and yon, but the pandemic brought us back together on Zoom. One of the people, Stephanie, got us all back together. Every other week we meet, and I was asked to write about how I became a political activist. We all were. And so one of the things I wrote about was, so many things, they're all flying together. But how in the student union at Temple, one day there were a few people who would have been considered the dorky, creepy type, I don't know.
Right.
And they had enormous pictures of Vietnam, scenes from Vietnam. And this was the first protest I had seen. I remember Mr. Wagner back in high school from the Honor Society took us also to see Madame New's father, who was speaking. He was speaking about how all of our funding for Vietnam was going into his his daughter's Paris wardrobe. But that's the first I knew of Vietnam then. And then here I was at Temple University in the student union. There's this demonstration with these pictures, and people were sort of mocking them at first because they weren't popular types. And I was a popular type. And I got up there and stood with them. And, because I just was so moved and thought this was so outrageous. And then I remember after that going around to sororities where I had friends in sororities like you, and talking about a big action, a big rally, peace rally that was going to be coming up. And my memory is that you got your sorority sisters interested in attending. And, I visited the fraternities where, of course, I knew boys in the fraternities. And so that was, just some of the the beginning of organizing around the Vietnam War, and of course went to countless demonstrations in Washington, D.C., and all the hopelessness of that era of when the hell, what do we have to do to get this war to end. Um, so that was, part of my activism. Also at Temple, I became part of a movement to abolish the grading system. At a lot of the meetings, because my mother had wanted me to grow up to be a secretary. When we were in high school, I, along with all the academics, I took typing and shorthand. So in a lot of these meetings, it was, oh, she knows shorthand. So my role wasn't a leader. It was doing the shorthand and typing up everything that was going on. And I started to think, what's wrong with this picture? Also, so that was at Temple. I also, for various reasons, right a term before I was going to graduate, I wanted to go off and travel. There's so many different ins and outs that I could say, but they take up too much time. At one point, in the very early, like 69, early 70s, I was in Berkeley. And I was a dropout, but I was also a drop-in. I would just drop into classes and things like that. But I was a Kelly girl in order to make a living. And I was assigned a stint with a doctor, a general practitioner who did a lot of gynecological work. And I remember, and at this time I was getting into the medicinal value of natural foods with my former Shippensburg best friend who lived in Berkeley, and learning a lot about health. And this doctor was telling women to douche with Physohex, which was the acne treatment that my friend was using on her face. And I thought, yeah, I thought, what? Why are you telling them to douche in the first place and to use that? And also one time an older woman with a mastectomy came in, and he wasn't sensitive enough to think for a minute that maybe he should warn me, prime me, about what I would be seeing. He had the sensitivity of a dead rat. I don't know. Anyway, this just really opened my eyes, and I knew that I wanted to be involved in women's health care. So then after that time in Berkeley, I moved to Bucks County, and I was involved in so many things. In a way, the Back to the Land movement. I was involved in yoga, and also, the medicinal value of natural foods and growing your foods. I think in there I was involved in trying to get a food co-op off the ground. And yeah, so I was involved in spirituality and politics, and I could not understand why there seemed to be a chasm between the two for most people. Like yogis wouldn't dream of being in any kind of political movement, and politicos, spirituality, and for me, the two were just so entwined, because, they both had to do with really love and compassion. And it just, eventually I talked this up and got more people to bridge that divide. But so in Bucks County, and I'm very glad, at one point I started this little red book, which is falling apart. I managed to find it in a file cabinet with old resumes. But some things that influenced me, like also, going to Temple University and having a major in secondary education and minor in I guess it was English literature. Temple's Department of Education, or at least the way I was involved in it, was uh, very oriented to educational psychology. And I always had to work. And, I worked in high school and then I worked in college. I worked for an educational psychologist, two different ones while I was there. And, that had an influence on my future profession. I think one of the jobs I had, I was just reading it over last night, was interviewing young kids about how they were disciplined in school. I think child abuse laws didn't come into play until 1982. And so anyway, had very consciousness raising things going on there. And there was a YWCA in Germantown, I think Germantown and Shelton, and as a practicum in the education department, I was counseling young women there. I also, as part of Johnson's anti-poverty program, I had a job teaching creative dramatics in a playground with the young kids, but there were gang members all around the gate and I wasn't supposed to talk to them. And of course I did. And just did some ad hoc counseling with them. In that particular instance, I would say it was not more about girls, but I think it's so important to remember how sexism and the expectations put on boys are so detrimental also, and and limits choices for boys of certain classes. And so that came into the mix of counseling those boys. But and the little ones doing creative dramatics, that was both little boys and girls. Okay, so in Bucks County, I didn't realize how much of a Republican county it was. Just a quick example, I was the head teacher director of a child care center. And when the minister of the church, it was in a church and at first, and he said, what's your name? And I said my name, and he said, well, is that Miss or Mrs.? And I said, Ms. And he said, isn't that for manuscript? In Bucks County, I did get very involved in the women's health movement. I remember I was active raising money for Joanne Little for the Southern Poverty Law Center. There was the pro-health majority of the Medical Committee for Human Rights. I wrote petitions, went to meetings to gather and give information for the Consumer Board of the Health Services Administration of Southeast Pennsylvania. I was in Central Bucks County Now Health Task Force, and I created and distributed a local women's consumer healthcare questionnaire on local medical care, to give an evaluation. I arranged self-health program meetings and participated in marches on Washington around that. Title 20 for family planning. And then I saw an ad, I guess, that rural, and I live way up in Quakertown, and that the Planned Parenthood there wanted an outreach worker. And that was just a joy. I went in for the interview with the two women running the place, and we just fell in love with each other. And it was before answering machines. I think I came home, my phone was ringing off the hook. We're not interviewing anybody else, we want you. And sometimes you wonder, why didn't you stay in touch? Just like you and I over years had lost touch, but not completely, thank goodness. But I did lose touch with them, and I just love them. And then, I was the head teacher director of a childcare center, and
Did
just
you
going through my
stay
little.
involved with women's health stuff?
Yes, a thing like the child care center, with very, very poor Appalachia like children,
Mm-hmm.
you wind up doing a lot of counseling in a situation like that.
Yeah.
Many of them were single mothers, not all of them, but that was my daytime gig, and nights and weekends I was doing all these other things. And so let's see, that was 74 to 75. And then I got involved with a group of women, like we were founding mothers or sisters. I'm not sure whether to call us founding mothers or sisters, of a women's center for Bucks County.
Oh,
Yes, that is what we wanted to do. We wanted it to really be a woman's place, a place that it was just for women, whatever it would be, whatever would unfold. But part of it was, and this was mostly from me, to have a women's growth center as part of it, and to lead groups for women of all sorts. And I started to lead a group called Know Your Own Body. I was influenced very much by our bodies ourselves, of course, as we all were at that time.
uh-huh.
And just a lot of consciousness raising went on in the group about how important it was to remember that you have a body, to really make friends with your body in every way and appreciate it. And therefore, you will be taking care of your general health, your reproductive health, and that kind of thing. And, it was psychoeducational, but so I just mentioned the educational, but the psycho part was hearing from them, for all of them to be sharing their experiences. That was just, a very wonderful part of my life. It took ages to get it off the ground, or when you're that age, you think like a few years is just forever.
Right.
But, in a conservative county, we couldn't even find a place to meet besides each other's houses.
Right.
When there weren't any community places welcoming us to meet there. And eventually, some of the originators, like myself, started to burn out. After all, we did have our income making jobs that we had and so forth, and new blood came in, and we're changing the face of it. They brought in a male minister, and there was all kinds of upheaval. One of my friends said, look, if I call a woman's center, I want a woman answering the phone. I don't care if I'm just calling to ask what time it is. Also at this time, I got involved first as a volunteer, and then they hired me This was probably, I started around 76 until I left the area at some point in 1978. Concern for health options, information, care, and education, known as Choice. And they were housed out of the, I guess, sort of famous Friends Service Committee building on Cherry Street
Mhm.
in Philadelphia. And once again, this feeling of how did I not stay in touch with these magnificent women? My two direct bosses, supervisors, whatever you call, were Susan Thompson and Anne Rixnecker. Anyway, I was a patient advocate and birth control options counselor. As far as I remember, before abortion was legal in Pennsylvania, as we know, it was legal in New York. And the women of choice came together. I'm not sure how they came together, but they were a feminist organization that ran an underground railroad to get people from the Delaware Valley area, I guess it was called,
Right.
to get up to New York for very safe medical legal abortions.
Mhm.
And I'm not remembering exactly how I found out about it because, I was so involved in the women's health movement, some things I haven't even mentioned. Um, so I found out about it and, like I said, volunteered, and then they hired me as one of their patient advocates. And patient advocates, we protected the medical rights and emotional well-being as a liaison between the doctors, nurses, lab, any and other necessary hospital personnel, and the patient and the choice office. And we also gave emotional support not only to the woman who would be going through an abortion, but also the person who escorted her there. How this all came about was when abortion was legalized in 73, so many gynecologists in the Philadelphia, Delaware Valley area wanted referrals to do abortions. They knew this feminist organization had all this infrastructure already established and had their, you know, everybody knew to call them for
Mhm.
help. And so these doctors wanted to be in on that. And Joyce said, great, fine, as long as you consent to do whatever we tell you to do, basically. I was there as an advocate for the patients to make sure that that was happening,
Mhm.
to make sure, we were given a lot of training about what lab tests the women should be having. It was just a great job. The staff meetings with the women were wonderful. Everything I learned biologically and everything, it was just a marvelous, marvelous experience. And had I not made the decision that I wanted to come back out west and this time to San Francisco rather
Right.
than East Bay, who knows how long I would have continued to work for them because it was just an all around wonderful experience, personal, emotional support. And I don't know if you're interested in any anecdotal stories, but a patient, they all touched me deeply. But a patient who touched me very deeply had come because of, as the terminology we used in the day, a change of life pregnancy. She was a very religious Catholic. She came with her husband,
Mhm.
and they were just suffering because a year before their 16-year-old daughter was pregnant, and they forced her, she wanted to have an abortion, and they wouldn't hear of it. And they forced her, they had the power over her to go through the pregnancy. So now, not this woman, not only was she feeling the weight of the Catholic Church and her guilt about really needing her own abortion. At least she knew to be mad at her doctor who said, "Oh yes, you're pregnant, congratulations."
Right.
And she said, "He knows all my health issues at this juncture of my life, how it totally endangers my life to carry a pregnancy to term." And so, you know, we were just there for her 100%, and holding her hand emotionally. And she did go through with it. It was a very painful, and of course, we would not say anything about what she should do. And also, I should say, some people came with some ambivalence, and we offered
Right.
all choices,
Mm.
including, letting them know, you could carry this pregnancy to term and have a baby who you give to relatives until you're ready to raise your baby, and foster care, this or that or the other thing. But we said, you need to go to this out of the other place for counseling about that. But we
Right.
planted the seed that
Right.
these are options that
Right.
could happen. The seed planted was, someday, it's very possible that you and your daughter, when the age is right, when the time is right, will be able to process this. When I moved to San Francisco, I was more generally, I was really into getting my master's degree. And, I've always been involved in dance. And so this mixture of dance and politics and mental health all came together. So many things were going on at once. I think,
Right.
how did I ever have the energy to do all this?
Right.
But I went to a couple of month-long feminist dance workshops with a feminist dance theater troupe in San Francisco. And well, one of the trainings, the first one was actually up in Eugene, Oregon, but then they were here. And as a result of that, some of the women who had also been through the workshops, we decided to form our own little troupe called Moving Voices. And one of the things I did at that time was I wrote a poem about my mother creating while she was dying through my teenage eyes. She had knit me a bright orange sweater, and that's the name of the poem. And I wound up choreographing it and performing it along with other performances.
Oh.
We put together performances about incest, and which of course is not just a woman's issue, but appears to be overwhelmingly more women than men. And anyway, so we performed at the Women's Building and some dance studios and art galleries. And at this time, I was finishing up graduate school, and I got a job in the Student Union building at an office called Eros. It wasn't just an office, it was an activity center there, and it had to do with health and sexuality. I'm forgetting exactly what EROS stood for.
Mm.
I had been going through an internship at a place called Huckleberry House, where I worked with all kinds of youth, including sexual minority youth. And more and more, it was people were coming forward that they were not only emotionally abused or physically abused, they were sexually abused. And, in the back of people's minds, you kind of maybe heard about somebody's pervy uncle who would do this or that. But there was enormous blindness, minimizing, denying in the whole society about incest. And more and more as I learned about this, and here I was at this student organization, Eros, I thought, and the Women's Center, the Campus Women's Center was right next door. I started to put together a forum, a community forum on incest to raise awareness about this. And yeah, this is, I know I told you I was a foot soldier in many movements like the
Yeah.
then going through my little red book and my old resumes, I said I wasn't just a foot soldier. So anyway, this forum on incest at San Francisco State, I got a panel together. Sandra Butler, who wrote Conspiracy of Silence, The Trauma of Incest, and a woman named Sharon Bergeron, who I knew from the feminist dance theater work that I was doing. She was up north of here, Petaluma People's Service Center, and she was presenting a slideshow. Then a man I knew who would do some shows on KPFA, which I know you and many other people know of KPFA. His name was Rich Snowden, and he counseled male perpetrators of incest. Angela from an organization, Pleiades, I guess is how you pronounce it, a self-help activist group of survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And some of whom also at different times were sex workers. And the forum consisted of me giving an introduction of what it was all about. And and my old friend who unfortunately died about 8.5 years ago, she was a filmmaker and she filmed this, but very carefully to not film people's faces or anything.
I see.
People who, had never heard their issue aired publicly before, you're not going to have them. And after the panel, I had people break out into small groups, including one led by Rich Snowden for men. And this was a chance for male incest survivors to have their first group to talk. And amazingly, a man from a pro-incest organization actually showed up in the group. I have to say that really is the Women's Center choice, this forum on incest, those are, big deal, important things that I did.
I know you're a therapist and you got your master's degree, I guess, in social work. And
well, it's officially called marriage and family therapy.
okay, so you have been a practicing therapist for many years now.
Yes.
And so do you get many women or is it mostly women?
Well,
What's
at
been
first,
over the years.
yeah, at first I only wanted to see women. In the course of a long career, you go through different, in quotes, areas of specialization. For a time, I would think about 10 years, I led groups and workshops for women who lost their mothers, including on Mother's Day, when so many people, especially younger women, would see all their friends go off to be with their mothers. And there they were left abandoned on Mother's Day. A lot of women who were mothers, who had their own children, they still felt very strongly about coming to this workshop because I made it just in the afternoon. So they either had breakfast in bed, given by the family for Mother's Day, or taken out to dinner. But you know, I I could go into more detail
Right.
about the ritual, but it was like an afternoon ritual. I made a little memorial wall where you went up and said whatever it was your truth that you wanted to say about your mother, because there are people who did not have the most wonderful and uh, at times detrimental relationship with their mother. And I said, this is your opportunity to say what you learned not to do
Right.
from, that can be your benefit from having a problematic mother. So that's just, a piece of that. And I continue to work with it just became that my work was around grief and loss in general. I had a man call me and say, can I see you about my grief about my mother too? And I said, of course. And, I
Mhm.
started, and then, all the women and mostly women, but women and men who lost their fathers at a young age and the impact this has on your life forevermore. There's another great thing I was involved with politically. It wasn't just about women, but it was so great. I just want to briefly tell you about
Please,
it.
please.
In the early 80s, I mentioned this affinity group,
Mhm.
we were called the Peace Potatoes. And we did a lot of work around, including guerrilla theater, which I had earlier done around women's issues at different um, demonstrations. But anyway, San Francisco was very active in non intervention in Central America. And there were different organizations. There was the ERN, Emergency Response Network, and people had these affinity groups. And at the same time, people were very concerned about the nuclear freeze. And so there was a joining of forces to between Sane Freeze, it was called, and we were friends with the wonderful man who was the main person heading that up and who is no longer with us. Um, and Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. Uh, and my husband was on the steering committee of that. We formed, it went on for several years, a 12-hour dance marathon called Give Peace a Dance. We were on the steering committee of Give Peace a Dance. And back then, 80 some $1,000 was a lot of money. And we would raise that. I have to try to remember whether it was 3 years or 4 years, but it was just such a wonderful event to be involved in.
How would you say the years that that you lived, that when you were born and as things changed in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and certainly the women's movement affected your life? Like, what would you say? What do you think your life would have been like without it?
Oh my goodness. I would have to do some imagining. The word circles comes to mind.
Okay.
And beautiful things that I've heard Alice Walker talk about, the importance of circles, tribes since ancient times. Just recently I heard a Dharma talk, you could call it wisdom talk, by Tara Brach about dealing with the descent into the Dark Ages. And one of the images that she used in there was about redwood trees, and they don't have deep roots, these really enormous trees,
Really?
and you always find them in a circle, a family or a circle. And below the ground, because they don't have deep roots, their roots are entwined in a circle or circles. And that is how, in a sense, they all hold each other up.
Wow.
And I just love the image. I love that I am still involved in circles. My group, Therapists for Peace and Justice, that I've been in since about 2004, maybe. It formed right after 9/11. And I'm in a circle of elder women therapists who decided to change the name to Wise Wild Women. And my old affinity group and other circles. And so I don't know if this answers your
Yes,
question.
it does. It does.
When we came of age, women still couldn't have their own credit or buy property, I think.
Right.
And it was typical for men to not understand what is the problem with rape.
Right.
You
Right.
know, why don't you just decide to enjoy it? And
Relax. Yeah.
I'll just say this,
Yeah.
that you know, my husband and I talk about our coming of age, that period, like a blip on the radar screen of time as far as progressivism and that goes. Now, we could be wrong. It does seem like a special time. And as I say, that maybe every generation